From the outside, the cabin looked unfinished, not abandoned, not forgotten, just deliberately stripped down. No electricity lines, no running water, no road leading directly to the door. It sat deep in the forest near Lincoln, Montana. Quiet enough that the sound of wind through pine trees carried for miles, remote enough that months could pass without an unexpected visitor. This isolation was not an accident. It was the point. Long before investigators understood what this place represented, it was simply the home of a man who wanted to disappear from modern life. A man who believed that technology was not improving humanity, but slowly destroying it. This case would later teach investigators something uncomfortable. The most dangerous forms of extremism do not always begin with hatred of people. Sometimes they begin with hatred of systems. From a psychological perspective, this distinction matters. Ted Kaczynski was not born into violence. He was born into promise. He entered the world in Illinois during the early 1940s. From a young age, it was clear that his mind worked differently. Teachers noticed it first, then administrators, then psychologists. Standard classroom material bored him, repetition frustrated him, abstract thinking came naturally. By his early teens, standardized testing placed his intelligence quotient at an exceptionally high level, so high that experts struggled to find appropriate educational settings for him. Acceleration seemed like the only option. At 15 years old, he entered Harvard University. That detail alone often dominates discussions of his life. But it should not. Because intellectual advancement does not guarantee emotional development, and in cases like this, the imbalance can be profound. Classmates later describe him as quiet, not shy in the conventional sense, more withdrawn, observant, detached. He did not socialize easily. He did not blend into groups. He did not form close friendships. From a psychological standpoint, prolonged social isolation during formative years can amplify existing traits. Introversion can harden into alienation. Intellectual confidence can drift into moral certainty. Experts who later studied his background identified this period as significant, not because it caused what came later, but because it shaped how he related to the world. After completing his undergraduate studies, he continued forward without pause. Graduate school followed, then a doctorate in mathematics. By his mid-20s, he had achieved something few ever do. He became the youngest professor hired by the University of California at Berkeley. On paper, his life looked extraordinary. Prestigious education, elite academic position, a future defined by research and recognition. But something was missing. Teaching required interaction, collaboration, tolerance for ambiguity and disagreement. Those demands weighed on him. Colleagues later recalled that he struggled in the classroom, not because he lacked knowledge, but because he struggled to connect. Explaining complex ideas to students frustrated him. Questions felt disruptive rather than engaging. Within a few years, he resigned. This moment matters more than it appears. For many people, leaving an academic position would represent a detour, a chance to recalibrate. For him, it marked a rejection, not just of a job, but of the institutional world that surrounded it. In the late 1960s, he returned to Illinois briefly. Then, within a few years, he made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He moved to Montana, far from cities, far from universities, far from what he increasingly viewed as a corrupted society. Near the small town of Lincoln, he built a cabin by hand. It was intentionally primitive. No electricity, no plumbing, no modern conveniences. He wanted to live off the land, to hunt, gather, and grow his own food. To exist without dependence on systems he distrusted. At first, this experiment brought him a sense of control. Self-sufficiency became a form of identity. Each task completed without technology reinforced his beliefs. But isolation also magnifies thought patterns. As years passed, development crept closer, roads expanded, machinery cut through forested areas he had come to value. To him, this was not neutral progress. It was invasion. This is where ideology began to harden. From a psychological perspective, perceived loss of control is a powerful trigger. When individuals define their identity around a belief system, threats to that system feel personal, existential. He began to see industrial society as an enemy, not metaphorically, literally. Simple acts of protest followed, then deeper philosophical immersion. He read extensively, wrote obsessively, argued on paper with an imagined audience that never answered back. Over time, his thinking shifted from opposition to justification, from objection to entitlement. This transition is critical to understand. Experts in radicalization note a common pattern. When moral certainty combines with isolation, accountability disappears. Without social friction, extreme ideas go unchallenged. In his writings, he began to argue that conventional activism was ineffective, that warnings were ignored, that gradual change was impossible. He concluded that disruption was necessary. This is often the moment where belief systems cross a dangerous line, when ends begin to justify means. The first device was sent in the late 1970s. It targeted an academic institution. The symbolism was deliberate. Authorities initially viewed it as an isolated incident, an anomaly. But it was not. Over the years that followed, similar packages appeared. Universities, airlines, businesses connected, in his view, to technological expansion. Each incident reinforced his internal narrative. Each response from authorities validated his sense of importance. From a behavioral standpoint, this feedback loop is well documented. Attention, even negative attention, can entrench belief systems. As the years passed, the investigation grew. So did the mystery. The person responsible left few conventional clues. Materials were crude. Construction avoided standard manufacturing markers. False leads were planted intentionally. This was not impulsive behavior. It was methodical. And that distinction matters. Because methodical actions are not driven by chaos. They are driven by conviction. By the mid-1980s, the consequences escalated. Lives were lost. Others were permanently harmed. Yet the individual responsible remained unidentified. For investigators, this case became a lesson in patience and frustration. For psychologists, it became a case study in ideological extremism divorced from group dynamics. A lone individual, driven not by personal grievance against specific people, but by abstract opposition to society itself. Years later, he would attempt to force a broader audience to listen, through words rather than devices. A manifesto. Thousands of words outlining his worldview, condemning industrial society, calling for a return to primitive life. The decision to publish it was controversial, risky, but strategic, and it worked because language carries fingerprints. When family members recognized familiar phrasing, familiar rhythms, familiar beliefs, everything changed. But before that moment arrived, investigators were still in the dark, still chasing fragments. Still wondering how someone so isolated could sustain such a prolonged campaign. This is where the story truly turns. Because the key to understanding this case was never technical, it was psychological. And that understanding would only come when words, not evidence, finally pointed the way forward. The manifesto did not arrive quietly. It arrived with an ultimatum: publish these words, or the campaign would continue. For investigators, this created a dilemma unlike any they had faced before. Giving a national platform to an unidentified extremist carried real risk, but so did refusing. From an investigative psychology standpoint, the document itself was a potential breakthrough. Language reveals patterns. Patterns reveal identity, so the decision was made. Major newspapers published the text in the mid-1990s alongside an appeal for information. The hope was simple. Someone, somewhere, would recognize the voice behind the words. They were right. When Ted Kaczynski read the manifesto, he felt something unsettling. Not shock, recognition. Certain phrases felt familiar. Sentence structures echoed past letters. Ideas mirrored arguments he had heard years earlier. This reaction is significant. Linguistic recognition is rarely based on a single phrase. It emerges from rhythm, tone, and recurring conceptual frameworks. Experts later explained that writing style functions like a behavioral fingerprint. David did not act immediately. He struggled with doubt, with loyalty, with fear of being wrong. Eventually, he hired a private investigator. Together, they compiled previous writings and correspondence. These materials were provided to federal authorities. At the same time, the investigation had reached an extraordinary scale. 17 years, hundreds of personnel, millions of dollars. It had become one of the most complex and expensive manhunts in federal history. Yet progress had stalled. Some investigators resisted the new lead. The profile they envisioned did not match a former academic living in isolation. Others disagreed. This internal conflict delayed action. But linguistic analysis changed everything. Specialists compared the manifesto with older writings attributed to Ted Kaczynski. They identified consistent markers, unique phrasing, repeated metaphors, identical argumentative structures. From a forensic linguistics perspective, the match was compelling. Pressure mounted. When the suspect's name leaked to the media, authorities moved quickly. They feared that publicity could provoke flight or escalation. In early April of 1996, agents traveled to the Montana wilderness. They approached the cabin cautiously. What they found inside removed all remaining doubt. Handwritten journals, thousands of pages, detailed reflections, descriptions of ideological justification, and materials consistent with past incidents. One device was fully assembled. This moment marked the end of the search, but not the end of the story. During interrogation, he spoke calmly, methodically, without visible remorse. This demeanor is often misunderstood. Calm does not equal absence of emotion. In ideologically driven individuals, emotional expression is frequently internalized. Conviction replaces empathy. He was charged with multiple federal counts related to the attacks and resulting deaths. The legal process moved slowly. His attorneys urged a strategy based on mental illness. He refused. This decision reveals another psychological layer. He did not view his actions as irrational. He viewed them as necessary. Accepting an insanity defense would undermine the legitimacy of his beliefs. For him, that was unacceptable. In early 1998, he pleaded guilty to all charges. This avoided a trial. It also avoided the death penalty. He received multiple life sentences without the possibility of release. He was transferred to a super maximum security facility in Colorado. There, his isolation became absolute. No cabin, no forest, no illusion of independence, just concrete, steel, routine. For psychologists, the aftermath raised critical questions. How does a highly intelligent individual become consumed by absolutist ideology? Why do abstract beliefs override concern for human life? How does isolation accelerate radicalization? This case teaches us that extremism does not require group reinforcement. It can grow in solitude, fed by certainty, protected by intelligence. Warning signs were present long before the first incident. Social withdrawal, rigid thinking, moral absolutism, perceived victimhood by abstract forces. None of these alone predict violence. Together, unchecked, they can become dangerous. Today, the case is studied in multiple disciplines: criminal psychology, linguistics, counterterrorism, not because of the tactics involved, but because of the path that led there. Understanding that path matters. Because ideology, when insulated from challenge, can become a closed system, and closed systems resist correction. The legacy of this case is not the fear it created, it is the insight it offers. That violence rooted in belief is not spontaneous, it is constructed over years, in silence, and recognizing that process is the first step toward preventing it. The isolation that followed his sentencing was not a departure from his worldview. In many ways, it was its final expression. From a psychological standpoint, incarceration removed his ability to act, but not to rationalize. His writings continued. His beliefs remained intact. This is important to understand. Extremist ideologies do not always collapse when confronted with consequences. Often, they retreat inward. They become more refined, more rigid. Experts who later reviewed his prison correspondence noted consistency rather than regret. He framed his punishment as confirmation, proof that the system he opposed was incapable of tolerating dissent. This pattern is well documented. When an individual interprets all outcomes as validation, belief becomes impermeable. Success confirms righteousness. Failure confirms persecution. From an educational perspective, this case reshaped how investigators evaluate lone actor threats. Prior to this investigation, emphasis often rested on group affiliations, organizations, cells, networks. This case demonstrated something different. Ideological violence can emerge without recruitment, without coordination, without reinforcement. It can develop quietly, sustained by intellect, grievance, and time. One of the most lasting contributions of this investigation came from linguistic analysis. At the time, it was a developing discipline, rarely relied upon as primary evidence. Here, it proved decisive. Today, forensic linguistics is a standard investigative tool used in threat assessment, anonymous communications, extortion cases, online radicalization monitoring. This case accelerated its legitimacy. There were also broader societal lessons. Technological anxiety is not inherently pathological. Concern about environmental degradation is not extremism. Criticism of industrial systems is not violence. The danger arises when moral certainty eliminates proportionality, when abstract goals justify irreversible harm, when dialogue is replaced with coercion. Psychologists emphasize that prevention lies in interruption, exposure to diverse viewpoints, social accountability, constructive outlets for grievance. Isolation, especially when paired with intellectual superiority, removes those safeguards. This is why early intervention matters, not surveillance, not suppression, but engagement. As uncomfortable as that may be, in retrospect there were moments when alternative paths were possible, moments when connection could have altered trajectory, moments when belief might have softened instead of hardened. But history does not move backward. What remains is understanding. This case is no longer about a man in a cabin. It is about how ideas evolve, how they solidify, how they consume, and how, if left unexamined, they can convince someone that harm is not only acceptable but necessary. That lesson is why this story continues to be told. Before closing this story, there is one final layer that deserves attention. Not the acts themselves, but how society remembers them. Public memory often simplifies complex cases. Names become labels. Mottos become slogans. And understanding is replaced with shorthand. From an educational standpoint, this is risky. When individuals are reduced to caricatures, the underlying mechanisms disappear. The warning signs fade. The lessons are lost. This case is frequently summarized as genius turned extremist. But that framing is incomplete. Intelligence did not cause this trajectory. Nor did solitude alone, nor did ideology by itself. It was the convergence, a highly analytical mind, prolonged social isolation, rigid moral reasoning, and a growing belief that suffering could be justified for a greater good. Experts in criminal psychology stress that this pattern is not unique. It appears in different forms, different ideologies, different eras. What changes is the narrative used to legitimize harm. In this case, it was industrial society. In others, it may be politics, religion, identity, or grievance. The structure remains the same. Belief becomes absolute, opposition becomes evil, and humanity becomes secondary. This is why prevention focuses less on ideology itself and more on behavior. Withdrawal, fixation, dehumanization, moral certainty without accountability. These are the signals that matter. Today, professionals across law enforcement, mental health, and education study this case not out of fascination but necessity. It informs threat assessment models, intervention strategies, and risk evaluation frameworks. It also raises difficult questions about responsibility, where individual accountability ends, and where systemic failure begins. There are no simple answers. What can be said with clarity is this: violence framed as moral duty is among the hardest to stop, because it does not rely on emotion. It relies on logic, however flawed. And logic, once closed, resists contradiction. The legacy of this case is not fear, it is insight. Insight into how ideas, left alone for too long, can harden into justification. How isolation can replace dialogue, and how certainty can eclipse compassion. Understanding that process does not excuse harm, it prevents repetition. And that, ultimately, is why this story still matters.